The city pulsed with life, its streets filled with the rhythmic chaos of honking cars, hurried footsteps, and distant conversations blending into an urban symphony. Among the well-dressed businessmen and exhausted workers, a young girl wove through the crowd, her small frame barely noticeable. Emily was no stranger to these streets. She had learned their secrets, the places to hide, the best times to strike. Her heart pounded as she spotted her target, a tall man in an expensive suit, walking with an air of importance. His coat was sleek, his shoes polished to perfection, and his wristwatch gleamed under the city lights. He exuded wealth and power, someone who wouldn't miss a few stolen bills. Steeling herself, Emily moved swiftly, her nimble fingers slipping into his coat pocket. But before she could retreat, a firm hand clamped around her wrist. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" a cold voice growled. Emily's breath hitched. She looked up into the sharp, piercing gaze of Alexander Holt, a name feared in business circles for his ruthless deals and unforgiving nature. His expression was unreadable, but his grip tightened. "Let me go," she gasped, twisting her arm, but his strength was unyielding. For a brief moment, they stood frozen, a girl with desperation in her eyes and a man who had never been stolen from before. A sudden rush of panic overtook Emily. She did the only thing she could think of. She wrenched herself free with all her might and bolted. Alexander cursed under his breath. No one, not even seasoned criminals in his business empire, had dared steal from him. The humiliation burned in his chest. Without hesitation, he surged forward, chasing after the girl who had just made the worst mistake of her life. Emily's lungs burned as she dashed through the maze-like streets, her small frame allowing her to slip between people, dart through alleyways, and squeeze through narrow gaps. But no matter how fast she ran, she could hear the heavy, determined footsteps behind her. Alexander was relentless. He wasn't simply chasing a pickpocket. He was chasing retribution. His pride, his authority, his very image had been challenged. The girl had to be caught. Emily turned a sharp corner and found herself in a dimly lit alley. Garbage bins lined the walls, and the smell of damp cardboard and old food lingered in the air. She knew these alleys well. They were her sanctuary, a place where people like him wouldn't bother to go. But tonight, she had made a miscalculation, a dead end. Her chest rose and fell rapidly as she spun around, only to see Alexander step into the alley. The glow from a flickering street lamp illuminated his face, his sharp jaw clenched in frustration. He walked toward her with slow, measured steps, his expression cold and unforgiving. Emily backed away until her shoulders hit the brick wall. She felt like a cornered animal. "Now," Alexander said, his voice smooth but laced with warning, "you're going to tell me why you thought it was a good idea to steal from me." Emily's hands trembled as she clutched the stolen money to her chest. She had survived on the streets long enough to know that people like him never listened, never cared. But as his imposing figure loomed over her, she knew there was no escape. Tears welled up in her eyes as she whispered, "Please, I didn't do it for myself." Alexander scoffed. "Of course. A noble thief. How original." Emily shook her head violently. "I need to buy medicine. My mom, she's really sick. If I go to jail, who will take care of her?" For the first time since the chase began, Alexander hesitated. The desperation in her voice, the sheer terror in her eyes. It struck something deep within him. He had seen deception in countless business deals. He had witnessed grown men lie through their teeth to save their own skins. But this girl was different. A strange, unfamiliar sensation twisted in his chest. He narrowed his eyes. "Prove it." Emily blinked, uncertain. "Take me to your mother," he demanded. Torn between fear and urgency, Emily had no choice. Clutching the money tightly, she nodded and took off once more. Not running away this time, but leading him. And as Alexander followed, he couldn't shake the unsettling thought that, for the first time in years, he was chasing something other than money and power. The street seemed darker as they walked, the hum of the city fading away with each step Emily took toward her small apartment. The weight of her secret, the reality of her life, hung heavily between them. Alexander followed in silence, his mind racing with thoughts he didn't fully understand. He had seen poverty before, of course, but never up close, never with this kind of raw urgency. This wasn't just about survival, it was about something more. They arrived at a rundown building, the paint peeling from the walls, the windows grimy with years of neglect. Emily led him up 2 flights of stairs, each step creaking beneath their feet. The air smelled of dampness and decay, and Alexander felt a strange, almost oppressive weight pressing on his chest. She stopped in front of a door, pausing for just a moment before knocking gently. There was no answer. Emily's hand trembled as she tried the door handle, finding it unlocked. She pushed it open slowly, stepping inside and calling softly, "Mom?" The room was dimly lit, cluttered with the remnants of a life that had long since been forgotten by society. The small couch was covered in worn blankets, and a tiny kitchen area in the corner seemed almost non-existent in the crowded space. And there, lying on the couch, was Catherine, her pale face flushed with fever. Her breathing was shallow, slow, too slow. "Mom!" Emily's voice broke as she rushed to her side, shaking her mother gently. But Catherine didn't respond. Alexander watched the scene unfold before him, an unease gnawing at his gut. He had no attachment to this woman, no reason to care. But something in the quiet desperation of Emily's face struck him. This wasn't just a stolen purse or a petty crime. This was a desperate fight for survival. As Emily frantically searched through a drawer, pulling out empty bottles of medicine and useless scraps of paper, Alexander's gaze fell on Catherine's condition. It was bad, worse than he had expected. Without thinking, he stepped forward. "I'll take her to the hospital," he said, his voice firm, as though it was the most natural thing in the world. Emily looked up at him in disbelief. You can't." "I can," he replied, his tone unwavering. "Where's the nearest hospital?" Emily hesitated, her eyes darting between him and her unconscious mother. She was too scared to trust him, too afraid of what might happen. But the truth was, she had no other choice. "The free clinic," she whispered. Alexander didn't wait for further instructions. He crouched down beside Catherine, gently lifting her into his arms despite the protests in his mind. This wasn't his world, these weren't his problems. But for some reason, he couldn't walk away. The ambulance ride felt like an eternity. The sirens wailed, cutting through the stillness of the night, while Emily sat by her mother's side, her hand clutching Catherine's weak one. She glanced over at Alexander, who was sitting opposite them, his face a mask of concentration. He was trying to mask the discomfort. He was used to control, to making things happen in his own time, but this was different. He could feel the fragility of the moment, the urgency in the air. Emily's mind raced. She couldn't believe this was happening. She had never imagined anyone would come to her aid, let alone someone like Alexander. The man was known for being ruthless, cold-hearted, untouchable in his world of business. Yet here he was, helping her, giving her a chance. She wanted to ask him why, to demand an explanation for his strange act of kindness, but the words wouldn't come. What could she say? What could she possibly say to someone who had never known the kind of hardship she had faced every day? The ambulance stopped with a jolt, and the doors swung open, revealing the chaos of the emergency room. Doctors and nurses moved with practiced speed, their faces grim as they ushered Catherine away on a stretcher. Emily tried to follow, but a nurse gently stopped her. "Miss, you need to wait here," the nurse said, her tone kind but firm. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she sank into a nearby chair, her eyes fixed on the doors that had just swallowed her mother. Alexander stood beside her, watching her with an inscrutable expression. I don't know what to do," Emily whispered, her voice cracking. "What if it's too late?" Alexander didn't respond immediately. Instead, he placed a hand on her shoulder, a rare gesture of comfort. He could feel the weight of her despair, the fear of losing the only family she had left. He had never been a man to comfort others, never been one to show empathy. But for some reason, in this moment, he felt something stir inside him, something he couldn't quite place. "I'll take care of it," he said quietly. "You don't have to worry about the bills or anything. Just focus on your mother." Emily looked up at him, her eyes wide with disbelief. You do that? Alexander nodded, his face set in a firm expression. Yes. Emily didn't know what to say. She had never been offered help like this before, especially not from someone like him. But in this moment, she felt a flicker of hope, a tiny, fragile spark in the darkness. As the hours ticked by, the weight of the situation began to settle in. Alexander's mind whirled with thoughts of business deals, of plans that had to be executed, but for the first time, he couldn't focus on them. His mind kept drifting back to the girl beside him, to the mother fighting for her life, and to the strange pull he felt toward them. For once, Alexander didn't want to be in control. He just wanted to see them through this. And as the night wore on, he couldn't shake the feeling that his life had already begun to change. The sterile, buzzing hum of the hospital seemed to stretch on forever as Emily sat in the waiting room, her fingers nervously twisting the hem of her jacket. Time felt like it was slowing down, each minute dragging on as her mind raced with thoughts of her mother. Was she going to survive? Would the doctors be able to save her? Across from her, Alexander stood motionless, his gaze fixed on the doors through which they had taken Catherine. He had seen countless hospitals, countless emergencies. His world of business had taught him how to manage crises. But this was different. This wasn't a business deal or a corporate transaction. This was a human life, fragile and hanging in the balance. The hospital's fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting an unnatural, cold glow over everything. The door to the ICU opened with a faint whoosh, and a doctor stepped into the room, his face grim. Emily's heart skipped a beat. "How is she?" she asked, her voice hoarse with worry. The doctor hesitated for a moment, his eyes flicking toward Alexander before he spoke. "She's stable for now, but her condition is critical. We need to keep her under observation." "Can you do anything for her?" Alexander asked, his tone sharp, cutting through the tension. The doctor nodded slowly. "There's a surgery we could perform. It's risky, but it's her best chance. However, the procedure is expensive. I won't sugarcoat it. We need payment up front, or we can't proceed." Emily's breath caught in her throat. She looked at Alexander, her eyes wide with fear. How would they afford it? What would they do? Before she could speak, Alexander stood up and walked toward the doctor. "I'll cover it," he said flatly, his voice unwavering. Emily stared at him in disbelief. "What? No. I can't let you." Alexander cut her off with a wave of his hand. "You don't need to say anything. I'll take care of it." He turned to the doctor. "Arrange for the surgery immediately. Whatever it takes, just save her." The doctor gave a brief nod and turned to leave. Emily sat frozen, her mind reeling. Alexander Holt, the man who had made his fortune by breaking people, by using others to climb higher, was here, offering to save her mother. She didn't know what to think. She wanted to protest, to refuse his offer, but in her heart, she knew there was no other choice. Her mother's life was on the line, and right now, Alexander was the only person who could help. The next few hours were a blur. Emily sat in the waiting room, her thoughts tangled in a web of uncertainty. She tried to sleep, but every time she closed her eyes, the image of her mother lying unconscious in that cold hospital bed filled her mind. How could she have let things get this bad? How had they ended up in a situation where they were relying on a man like Alexander Holt? She glanced over at him, seated across from her, his jaw clenched in concentration. He was no longer the detached businessman she had first met, the man who chased her through the streets with rage in his eyes. There was something different about him now, something softer, more human. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. How could she even begin to thank him? Could she ever repay him for what he was doing? "I don't know how to thank you," she said quietly, her voice shaking with emotion. Alexander looked up at her, his expression unreadable. "You don't have to thank me. I'm doing what anyone would do." Emily shook her head. "Not anyone. You're not like anyone. You could have just walked away, like everyone else." He remained silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on the floor. "I don't know why I'm doing this," he admitted, his voice softer than she expected. "I've never been one to care about anything other than myself, but I don't know. Something about this feels different." She looked at him, trying to understand. She had never met anyone like him. Someone who could be so cold and calculating one moment, yet willing to offer so much the next. "I don't know what you want from me," she said, her voice trembling, "but I don't have anything to give." Alexander's eyes flickered with something almost like regret. "You don't owe me anything, Emily. All I want is for your mother to be okay. That's all." His words hung in the air, heavy and unexpected. Emily felt a strange sensation deep in her chest, a flicker of something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. She had spent so many years fighting for survival, struggling alone, that she had forgotten what it felt like to trust, to let someone else in. As the hours passed, Emily's exhaustion caught up with her, and her eyelids grew heavy. She didn't remember falling asleep, but when she woke, the clock showed that it was almost dawn. She sat up, her body sore from the long hours spent waiting. The door to the waiting room opened, and a nurse stepped in, her expression serious. "Emily," the nurse said softly, "your mother made it through the surgery. She's stable now. You can see her soon." Emily's heart leapt into her throat. "She's okay?" The nurse nodded. "For now, yes. But she still has a long way to go." Tears blurred Emily's vision as she stood, feeling the weight of the past hours begin to lift, even if just a little. She turned to Alexander, her voice filled with quiet gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. Alexander only nodded, his face unreadable once more. But this time, there was no coldness in his eyes. There was something else, something softer. For the first time in a long time, Alexander Holt didn't feel so alone. The hospital's fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting a pale glow over the sterile hallway. Emily stood by her mother's bedside, her hand gently holding Catherine's, refusing to let go. She hadn't left her side since the surgery, not even for a moment. Outside the room, Alexander stood by the door, watching silently. He had made sure the best surgeon had been brought in, that every necessary step had been taken to give Catherine the best chance at survival. But now, as he watched Emily, something unexpected stirred within him. He had never been one for emotions, for connecting with people in a way that went beyond the transactional. But standing here, witnessing the quiet strength and desperation in Emily's eyes, he felt something shift within him, a deep, almost unsettling empathy. He had given her a lifeline, and now it felt like he was watching her struggle with the weight of the hope he had given her. Emily's voice trembled as she spoke to her mother, her words a soft whisper, filled with love and fear. "Please, Mom, don't leave me. I need you. I can't do this alone." Alexander felt his throat tighten as he listened. He had never had anyone who depended on him like this, never had a bond like the one between Emily and her mother. His world had always been about power, control, and success. The love he was witnessing now, it was foreign to him. And yet, it made him question everything he had believed about himself. "Everything is going to be okay," Emily whispered again, though she wasn't sure she believed it herself. Her mother's shallow breathing was a constant reminder that they weren't out of the woods yet. Alexander stepped closer, unable to stay at a distance any longer. "She's a fighter," he said quietly, his voice almost a whisper, as though he was speaking to himself more than to her. Emily looked up at him, surprised by the gentleness in his tone. She hadn't expected him to say anything like that. He was the type of man who usually dealt in cold, hard facts, not comforting words. "I know," she replied, her voice hoarse. "She always has been." For a moment, they both stood in silence, watching Catherine's steady but weak breathing. But then the heart monitor beside the bed let out a sharp, alarming beep. The sound sent a jolt of fear through both of them. Emily's hand tightened around her mother's, and Alexander's breath caught in his chest. A team of doctors rushed into the room, pushing them aside as they began working frantically. Emily stepped back, her heart pounding in her chest as she watched them. She had no idea what was happening, only that every second felt like a lifetime. "Stay strong, Emily," Alexander said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "She's a survivor." Emily didn't respond. She couldn't. All she could do was watch as the doctors worked, the weight of her mother's life pressing down on her like a heavy stone. Minutes felt like hours as the doctors fought to stabilize Catherine's condition. Emily remained at her mother's side, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. She had no idea what was happening, and every second that passed without answers made the fear grow deeper inside her. Alexander stood quietly in the corner, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He felt like an intruder in this intimate moment, like a spectator to a fight he could never fully understand. But despite the uncomfortable foreignness of the situation, something in him refused to leave. The stillness, the fear in Emily's eyes, had settled deep inside him. The door to the room swung open, and the head surgeon stepped in, wiping his hands on a sterile cloth. His face was tired, but there was a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "She's stabilized," the surgeon said, his voice calm but not without relief. "The surgery was a success, but it will take time. We still need to monitor her closely. She's not out of danger, but she's made it through the worst of it." Emily let out a breath she didn't even realize she had been holding. She looked over at Alexander, her eyes wide with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice shaking with emotion. "I don't know what to say." Alexander only nodded, his face unreadable. He hadn't expected to feel this way, this strange, heavy sense of relief. But there it was. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to feel something other than detachment. "I told you she'd make it through," he said softly. "She's strong." Emily didn't respond, but the look in her eyes said it all. She knew she was lucky. She had been given a chance, and she would do whatever it took to make sure her mother made a full recovery. As the doctor left to attend to other patients, Emily sank into the chair beside her mother's bed, her heart still racing, her emotions raw. She reached out and gently stroked Catherine's hand, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "I'm here, Mom. You're going to be okay." Alexander stood silently by the window, watching the scene unfold. He had given her the chance for this moment, but he could see it now. The way Emily's love for her mother anchored her in this moment of uncertainty. It was a love so pure, so deep, that it could defy everything else. For the first time, Alexander felt a twinge of envy, though he couldn't explain why. His life had always been about winning, about power and control. But standing here, in this sterile hospital room, watching the bond between mother and daughter, he realized something he had never known before. The greatest strength wasn't in wealth or status. It was in love. And in this quiet, fragile moment, Alexander knew that his life had irrevocably changed. The days following Catherine's surgery passed in a blur of sleepless nights and endless monitoring. Emily rarely left her mother's side. Even when the doctors insisted she get rest, she would curl up in a chair beside her mother's bed, eyes fixed on Catherine's still form, her heart constantly fluttering with anxiety. Despite the surgeon's optimism, the truth lingered like an unspoken shadow. Catherine had come through the worst, but she was far from out of danger. Each time the heart monitor beeped erratically or Catherine's pulse dropped, Emily's breath would catch, and her pulse would quicken. She would hold her mother's hand tighter, whispering soft words of encouragement, wishing with every fiber of her being that she could somehow make everything better. Alexander, though still largely silent, was never far from her. He had made himself a fixture in the background of their lives, quietly providing for their needs, arranging for the best care possible, and offering reassurance when Emily couldn't find the strength to offer it to herself. He had his own battles to fight, but somewhere between the sterile walls of this hospital room and the endless nights of waiting, he had found a different kind of purpose. It wasn't one he could easily explain, not to himself or to anyone else. The same man who had once been driven by ambition, by the constant need to win, now found himself uncharacteristically invested in the well-being of a stranger and her mother. Emily stood beside her mother's bed again, the familiar ache of worry gripping her chest. Catherine's breathing had become shallower, her pulse weak. Emily's stomach twisted in knots as she looked at the monitors, feeling that familiar sense of dread creeping in. Suddenly, the monitors began to beep rapidly, sending alarms echoing through the sterile room. Emily's heart dropped into her stomach. "Doctor! Nurse!" she screamed, her voice cracking. She tried to press the button to call for help, but her trembling fingers fumbled with the device. Alexander was at her side in an instant, his presence sharp and steady in the chaos. "Stay calm," he said firmly, his hand on her shoulder, offering her the strength she needed. Emily's eyes were wide with fear as she looked at him. She's slipping away," she whispered, her voice breaking. Within moments, a team of doctors rushed into the room, pushing Emily and Alexander aside as they worked on Catherine. The room was filled with frantic voices, the sounds of machines, and the rush of professionals trying to stabilize her. Emily felt like she was watching from the outside, powerless as they did everything they could to save her mother. It was as if the world had tilted off its axis. Everything, all the progress, the hope, the pain, hung in the balance in that one fragile moment. And for the first time, Emily felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel. Not truly, not until now. Fear. Real, raw fear. She was on the verge of losing the only person who had ever truly been there for her. Time seemed to stretch as the medical team worked, each second feeling like an eternity. Alexander watched the scene unfold, his jaw clenched tightly, his mind racing. He had the resources. He had the power. But nothing could make this moment any easier. There were no solutions, no quick fixes. This was life and death, and they were all helpless in the face of it. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the chaos subsided. The monitors settled, and Catherine's vitals began to stabilize. Emily collapsed into the chair beside her mother's bed, her body shaking as the tension drained from her. Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't know if they were from relief or from the sheer exhaustion that threatened to overwhelm her. Alexander stood at the foot of the bed, his posture still rigid, his mind a storm of thoughts. He had seen so much in his life, so much darkness, so much suffering. But the raw, unrelenting power of Emily's love for her mother, the sheer force of her desire to keep her mother alive, had made him question everything. For the first time in his life, he wasn't certain that his money or power could solve anything. The only thing that mattered in this moment was something far beyond anything he had ever understood. The fierce, unstoppable will to love. The room was quiet now, the tension easing, though the air still hung heavy with the unspoken. Emily sat beside her mother, her eyes closed as she rested her head on the edge of the bed, her hand clasped tightly around Catherine's. The pale, soft glow of the early morning sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting long shadows across the sterile floor. Alexander had stayed, as he had every night, never asking for anything in return. In the past, he would have taken his leave and returned to the business of the world outside, a world where people and problems could be solved with money and influence. But something had changed. Maybe it was the way Emily's mother had fought for her life, or the way Emily never wavered in her devotion. Whatever it was, Alexander couldn't bring himself to walk away just yet. As Emily dozed in the chair, Catherine's chest rose and fell, steady but slow. Then, a faint sound broke the stillness of the room. It was the faintest whisper, a name. Emily. Emily's eyes fluttered open, her heart racing at the sound of her mother's voice. "Mom? Mom, are you awake?" she asked, her voice thick with emotion. Slowly, Catherine's eyes cracked open, her gaze blurry but focused. Her lips parted, and she gave a faint, weak smile. "Emily," she repeated, her voice raspy and strained. "You're here." Tears sprang to Emily's eyes, and she squeezed her mother's hand, as if to reassure herself that this wasn't a dream. "I'm here, Mom. I'm here. You made it through. You're going to be okay." Catherine's smile grew a little, though her exhaustion was evident. "You're strong, Emily. You've always been so strong." Emily shook her head, her own tears slipping freely now. "I couldn't have done it without you, Mom. You're the one who's strong. You're the one who fought for me." A soft silence settled over them, filled with the weight of shared history and love. But as Emily gazed at her mother, her thoughts shifted. She wasn't alone anymore, and neither was Catherine. Across the room, Alexander stood by the window, his hands in his pockets, watching the reunion between mother and daughter. He wasn't sure why he felt the way he did in this moment, like an outsider, perhaps, but there was something about it, something powerful, that made him realize how far he had come from the man he used to be. He had given them a chance, but in return, they had shown him something far greater than anything he could have imagined. In their quiet strength, he had seen a new kind of power, one that didn't come from wealth or status, but from love. And for the first time in his life, he understood. The soft hum of the machines in the hospital room was now almost a comforting rhythm, a backdrop to the quiet peace that had settled in. Catherine had drifted back to sleep, her breathing steadier than it had been in days. Emily, still holding her mother's hand, watched the rise and fall of Catherine's chest with a sense of cautious hope. She had almost lost her once, and now that she had her back, she didn't want to let go. Not of her mother, and not of this newfound feeling of safety. But there was still so much uncertainty. They had nothing. They had no home, no financial security, and no clear way forward. It was only then that Emily turned to Alexander, who had remained by the window, silently watching them both. His presence had become familiar, though she still didn't fully understand why he had stayed. He was a man who had the world at his feet. Money, influence, power. And yet, he had chosen to stay in this sterile hospital room, in the quiet turmoil of their lives. Her voice broke the silence, soft but clear. "You've done more than enough, Alexander. I don't know how to thank you. You saved her life, but we can't keep relying on you like this." Her voice faltered as she struggled to put her thoughts into words. Alexander turned his gaze toward her, his expression unreadable. "You don't owe me anything," he said simply, though his voice carried an edge that made Emily pause. "I've done what anyone would have done, but I'm not the kind of person who walks away after fixing a problem, Emily. That's not who I am." Emily met his eyes, her heart racing. She had never seen this side of him before. The man who had been cold and distant, so removed from the world he lived in. Now, something had changed. He had seen the raw, vulnerable parts of their lives, and instead of running, he had stayed. "There's nothing more I can give you," she said, almost as a whisper. "We're barely making it as it is. We don't have a home. I don't know what we're going to do once my mom is released." There was a long pause before Alexander took a step closer, his gaze unwavering. "I don't want you to have to worry about that," he said quietly. "I have a place. A house. Plenty of room. You and your mother can stay there." Emily blinked, stunned by his words. Her first instinct was to reject the offer. She couldn't. They couldn't accept such a gesture from someone like him. They were strangers, after all. "I know this sounds sudden," Alexander continued, almost as if reading her thoughts, "but I've seen the way you've fought for her, and I've seen how far you've come, how much you care. I'm offering this because you've proven you deserve something better, something stable." Emily opened her mouth to protest, to argue that she couldn't possibly accept such a gift, but she couldn't find the words. There was something so raw in his offer, something that made her heart ache with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. She glanced down at her mother, still lying quietly in the bed, unaware of the conversation taking place. Catherine would need time to recover, and they would need time to figure out their next steps. The uncertainty had been so overwhelming. And now, here was Alexander, offering a chance for stability, a chance to rebuild. "Why?" she finally asked, her voice small. Alexander's expression softened, and for the first time, Emily saw something vulnerable in him. "Because I see you. I see how hard you're fighting. And maybe I'm not the man I used to be anymore. Maybe I've learned something in the process of being here, with you. I'm not just offering you a house. I'm offering you a chance to start over, to heal." Emily stood there, speechless, overwhelmed by the gravity of his words. She had always been so focused on survival, so determined to get through each day, that she hadn't realized how much she needed someone to help her. She had never asked for help, not from anyone, not even from her mother. And now, here was this man, someone she didn't know, someone who had no reason to care, offering her everything. I don't know what to say," she whispered, her voice catching. "But we can't just take something like that from you. We don't even know each other." "You know me more than you think," Alexander replied softly. "And I know you, too. I see what you've been through. I see your strength." Emily met his gaze, her heart a tangled mess of emotions. It wasn't just the offer of a house. It was the understanding, the connection. It was the way Alexander had shown up for her, not because he had to, but because something had shifted in him, something that couldn't be bought or forced. And for the first time in a long time, Emily allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things could get better. The car ride to Alexander's estate was quiet, but not uncomfortable. Emily sat in the back seat, her hands clasped tightly around her purse, her mind still reeling from everything that had happened. Beside her, Catherine was quietly asleep, her face soft with the restfulness of recovery. Emily kept stealing glances at her mother, still marveling at the miracle that had brought them to this point. For the first time in weeks, the constant weight of worry had begun to lift, replaced by a tentative sense of hope. Alexander drove in silence, his hands steady on the wheel, his eyes focused on the road ahead. He had made the offer, and now, as they neared the house, he found himself wondering if it had been the right choice. But there was no turning back now. He had seen something in Emily that had struck a chord in him, and he wasn't about to let her go through this alone. The car turned down a winding driveway, the headlights illuminating the path that led to a large, elegant estate surrounded by lush greenery. As they pulled to a stop in front of the grand entrance, Emily's breath caught in her throat. This is where you live?" she asked, her voice soft with awe. Alexander simply nodded, not offering any grand explanation. The house was impressive, but it wasn't the house that mattered. It was the gesture. It was the chance he had given her, the chance he had never even given himself until now. When they stepped inside, Emily felt a strange sense of calm settle over her. The space was warm, inviting, with sunlight pouring through the windows, casting golden light over the soft furnishings. It was a home, not just a house. A place where they could breathe, where they could heal. As Emily looked around, she realized that something had shifted inside of her, too. It wasn't just the house, the money, or the resources. It was the realization that life wasn't just about surviving. It was about connection, about love, about the people who stood beside you through the hardest moments. And as she turned to look at Alexander, she knew that, in the end, it had been that love that had brought them all here. It wasn't about the past or the mistakes that had been made. It was about the future, the possibility of new beginnings, new chances, and, maybe, a new kind of family. "Thank you," Emily whispered, her voice filled with emotion, "for everything." Alexander didn't respond right away. He simply nodded, a small, meaningful smile on his face. And in that moment, as he watched Emily, he knew that something within him had been irrevocably changed. The richest people in the world often sought treasures that couldn't be measured in money or gold. He had found his treasure in the most unexpected place, in Emily, her mother, and the family they had created together. And for the first time, he felt like he had finally found home. Thank you so much for sticking with us and listening to the entire story. We truly appreciate you taking the time to be a part of this journey. If you enjoyed the story, please don't forget to like the video, share it with your friends, and hit that subscribe button so you never miss out on future content. Your support means the world to us, and it helps us keep bringing you more stories like this one. Thank you again for being here, and we'll see you in the next one.